The Keeper of Forgotten Maps. Chapter 1. Quiet Work. Elias Thorvald lived a quiet life. He worked in a large stone library on the edge of Bergen, a coastal city in Norway. The building was old, with tall windows and wooden floors that creaked under every step. The air inside always smelled of paper, ink, and dust. Most people in the city had forgotten about the library. It was too far from the center and too strange for casual visitors. But Elias liked it that way. He was the archivist, the one responsible for the oldest and most mysterious part of the collection. His main task was to care for the ancient maps stored deep in the library's lower vaults. These maps were not ordinary. They did not show roads or borders. They showed places that no longer existed, or perhaps had never existed in the way people understood. Some maps were drawn with symbols that no one could read. Others changed slightly each time they were opened. A few were locked behind glass, sealed with runes and warnings. Elias had studied these maps for many years. He had learned to read their signs and feel their energy. He knew which ones were safe to touch and which ones were better left alone. He believed that the maps were doors to forgotten worlds, places hidden behind time, mist, and memory. Some led to lands of wonder, others to places of danger. But all of them held power. And power, Elias knew, must be guarded. He was not a wizard or a warrior. He was a man of knowledge and patience. He spent his days cataloging scrolls, repairing torn parchment, and writing notes in his thick journal. He rarely spoke to anyone. His only regular visitor was Lena Hartvig, a young researcher from the university. She came once a week to study the maps and ask questions. Elias liked her curiosity. She respected the rules and never tried to open what was sealed. Outside the library, the world moved quickly. Ships arrived in the harbor, merchants shouted in the market, and children ran through the streets. But inside, time felt slower. Elias often worked by candlelight, even during the day. He believed that silence helped him hear the whispers of the maps. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the cracks in the windows, he thought he could hear voices from faraway lands. He had no family and few friends. People in Bergen called him strange, but he didn't mind. He had chosen this life. He believed that someone had to protect the forgotten knowledge. If the maps fell into the wrong hands, terrible things could happen. He had read stories of explorers who vanished, of towns swallowed by fog, of doors that opened and never closed again. He had seen enough to know that the danger was real. One cold morning in October, Elias was working in the vault. He was cleaning the glass case that held one of the oldest maps, a piece of parchment covered in faded red ink and strange symbols. As he polished the surface, he felt a chill run down his spine. He looked up and saw a shadow move across the floor above. It was not Lena. She never came this early. Elias climbed the stairs and walked to the main hall. The front door was open, and a man stood near the entrance. He wore a long coat and carried a leather bag. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Elias had never seen him before. The man smiled and stepped inside. At that moment, Elias felt something shift in the air. It was small, like a whisper, but clear. The maps were watching. Something was about to change. And Elias, the quiet keeper of forgotten maps, knew that his peaceful days were coming to an end. Chapter 2. The Outsider Appears. The man who entered the library called himself Martin West. He looked like a traveler, with a long coat, worn boots, and a leather bag that had seen many roads. His voice was calm, and his words were polite. He said he was a historian, studying ancient routes and forgotten paths. Elias listened carefully, as he always did with visitors. But something about Martin felt unusual. Martin walked slowly through the library, looking at the shelves and old cabinets. He asked questions about the history of the building, about the oldest maps, and about the symbols used by early explorers. His interest seemed real, but Elias noticed how often Martin's eyes returned to one particular case. It was a sealed glass box, placed in a quiet corner of the vault. Inside it was a map drawn in red ink, covered in strange symbols and faded lines. That map had not been touched in over 50 years. Elias had always kept that map locked away. It was one of the most powerful in the collection. It was said to lead to a place where time moved differently, where the rules of nature did not apply. The map had been sealed by the last guardian before Elias, and the case was protected by old runes carved into the wood. Elias had never opened it, and he had never allowed anyone near it. Martin stood in front of the case for a long time. He didn't speak. He just stared, as if trying to read the symbols through the glass. Elias watched him from a distance. He didn't interrupt, but he made a note in his journal. He had learned to trust his instincts, and something about Martin's silence felt wrong. Over the next few hours, Martin continued to ask questions. He wanted to know how the maps were stored, how they were protected, and who had created them. Elias answered with care, giving only general information. He didn't want to reveal too much. Martin smiled often, but his eyes never softened. They stayed sharp, always searching. When the sun began to set, Martin thanked Elias and left the library. Elias locked the doors and walked through the halls, checking each room. He paused at the sealed case and looked at the map inside. The symbols seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. He felt uneasy, but he told himself that the case was secure. That night, the wind howled outside, and the library creaked with age. Elias couldn't sleep. He stayed in his small room above the vault, listening to the sounds below. Just after midnight, he heard a soft crack. It was not loud, but it was clear. He grabbed his lantern and went down the stairs. The vault was cold and quiet. The shelves stood in perfect order. But when Elias reached the corner, he stopped. The glass case was broken. The runes had faded. The map was gone. Elias stood in silence, holding the lantern close. He felt the air shift around him. It was colder now, and the shadows seemed deeper. He knew what had happened. Martin had taken the map. And with it, he had opened a door that should have stayed closed. The library was no longer safe. The world was no longer quiet. Something had begun. And Elias, the keeper of forgotten maps, had to act before it was too late. Chapter 3. Awakening. Elias stood in the cold silence of the vault, staring at the broken glass. The map was gone. The runes that once glowed faintly on the wooden frame had faded into dull scratches. The air around him felt heavier, as if the room itself had stopped breathing. He looked up at the old clock on the wall. Its hands had frozen at midnight. That had never happened before. He knew then that something had changed. The map was not just a piece of parchment. It was a seal, a lock, a boundary. It held back something ancient, something that did not belong in this world. Without it, the balance between realms could break. Elias had read about such things in the oldest texts, stories that most people believed were myths. But he had always known they were warnings. He walked slowly through the library, checking every door and window. Nothing else had been touched. Only the map. That meant Martin had come for one reason. He had known what he was looking for. And that made him more dangerous than Elias had first thought. Elias returned to his desk and opened a drawer. Inside was a small wooden box. He unlocked it and took out a folded letter. It was written in careful handwriting, addressed to Lena Hartwig. She was a researcher from the university, young but sharp. She had spent years studying forgotten places and strange symbols. She had always asked the right questions, and she had always respected the silence of the library. Elias had trusted few people in his life, but he trusted Lena. He sent a message to her that morning, asking her to come at once. She arrived before noon, her coat still wet from the rain. Her eyes were wide with concern as she listened to Elias explain what had happened. She didn't laugh or doubt him. She believed him. That was why he had chosen her. Together, they returned to the vault. Lena examined the broken case and the empty space where the map had been. She touched the edge of the glass and whispered something under her breath. Elias watched her closely. She had always been curious, but now she looked afraid. Not for herself, but for what might come. They spent the rest of the day searching the library for clues. Elias opened old journals and scrolls, looking for any mention of the stolen map. Lena studied the symbols left behind, comparing them to her own notes. As the sun set, the library grew darker, and the candles cast long shadows on the walls. Then something strange happened. A soft light appeared in the far corner of the hall. It was pale and flickering, like moonlight seen through water. Elias and Lena walked toward it slowly. The light hovered above the floor, just beside the shelf where the oldest maps were kept. It pulsed gently, as if breathing. Elias reached out his hand, but the light vanished. In its place, a small mark had appeared on the floor. It looked like a symbol from the stolen map. Lena bent down to study it. She said it was a gate mark, an ancient sign used to open paths between worlds. That confirmed Elias's fear. The map had been used. A door had been opened. They knew they had to act quickly. If Martin had crossed into another realm, he might not return alone. The stories spoke of creatures that lived in the spaces between time. Some were harmless. Others were not. If the wrong one entered their world, it could bring chaos. Elias packed a small bag with tools, notes, and protective charms. Lena did the same. They didn't know where the path would lead, but they knew they had to follow it. The map was gone, but the symbols it left behind were like a trail. And they were the only ones who could read it. As they stepped out into the cold night, the wind picked up. The sky above Bergen was dark, and the stars were hidden behind clouds. But Elias felt a strange calm. He had spent his life guarding the maps. Now, he would protect the world they were meant to keep safe. The awakening had begun, and there was no turning back. Chapter 4. The Chase. Elias and Lena left the quiet streets of Bergen behind. The mountains stood tall in the distance, covered in mist and shadow. The path they followed was old and narrow, winding between rocks and trees. Few people used it anymore. It was a forgotten trail, just like the maps Elias had guarded for years. But now, the trail was alive with strange energy. The ground trembled under their feet, and the sky above grew darker with each step. They walked in silence, listening to the wind. It carried whispers, soft voices that seemed to speak in a language neither of them understood. Lena stopped often to study the stones along the path. Some were marked with symbols, carved deep into the surface. She recognized a few from the stolen map. They were signs of passage, warnings left by those who had walked this way long ago. Elias moved carefully, watching the land around them. He had read stories about these mountains. They were said to hold secrets, places where the world bent and time shifted. He had never believed all the tales, but now he saw them with his own eyes. The trees leaned in strange directions. The air felt thick, like water. And the light changed without reason, bright one moment, dim the next. After 2 days of travel, they found a small camp hidden between two cliffs. The fire was cold, but the ashes were fresh. Someone had been there recently. Lena searched the area and found a leather journal half buried under a stone. It was Martin's. The pages were filled with notes, drawings, and thoughts. He had written about the map, about the gate, and about his dream of entering a world where time had no power. Martin believed that beyond the gate, he could escape death. He wrote about a place where people lived forever, where the rules of nature did not apply. He wanted to find it, to step into it, and to become something more than human. But his words were not calm. They were rushed, wild, and full of obsession. He had stopped writing about history and started writing about power. Lena read the journal with care. She saw how Martin's thoughts had changed. He was no longer a curious man. He was a man chasing something dangerous. She showed Elias a page where Martin described the gate. It was not just a doorway. It was a living thing, guarded by forces older than the world. He had seen signs of it in his dreams, and he believed the map would lead him there. Elias felt a chill. He knew that some maps were more than tools. They were keys. And some keys should never be used. He looked at the sky. It was darker now, and the wind had stopped. The silence was deep and unnatural. They were close. They continued up the mountain, following the symbols carved into the rocks. The path became harder, steeper, and more twisted. The land around them shifted. Stones moved without touch. Shadows stretched across the ground, even when the sun was gone. Lena held her notebook tightly, marking each sign they passed. She was brave, but she was also careful. She knew they were walking into something unknown. Elias felt the weight of his duty. He had spent his life protecting the maps, keeping the world safe from what they could unlock. Now, one had been taken, and the gate was near. He didn't know what waited beyond it, but he knew they had to stop Martin before he crossed. As night fell, they reached a high ridge. Below them was a valley filled with mist. In the center stood a circle of stones, glowing faintly with red light. Elias and Lena looked at each other. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They knew this was the place. The chase was over. The gate was ahead. And the real danger was about to begin. Chapter 5. The Gate. Elias and Lena reached the top of the mountain just before sunset. The sky was painted with deep orange and gray, and the air was colder than it had been all day. The wind had stopped, and everything around them felt still, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. In the center of the rocky plateau stood a circle of ancient stones. They were tall, weathered, and covered in faded carvings. The ground inside the circle was smooth and dark, like glass. Martin was already there. He stood in the middle of the stone circle, holding the stolen map in both hands. His coat moved gently in the windless air, and his eyes were fixed on the symbols glowing on the parchment. He looked different now, less like a traveler and more like someone who had crossed a line. His face was calm, but his body was tense. He was focused, lost in the moment, as if he had become part of the map itself. Elias stepped forward, trying to speak, but the air around the circle pushed him back. It was not a wall, but a force, cold and invisible. The gate was beginning to open. A low hum filled the air, and the stones started to glow with a soft red light. The symbols on the map pulsed like a heartbeat, and the ground inside the circle began to shimmer. Lena moved quickly, her eyes scanning the symbols and the stones. She had studied these signs before, but never like this. They were alive now, reacting to the map and to Martin's presence. She saw the danger clearly. The gate was not just a doorway. It was a living boundary between worlds. And Martin was breaking it. Suddenly, the air turned icy. A wave of cold spread across the mountain, and the sky above darkened. From the center of the circle, a mist began to rise. It was thick and silver, swirling around Martin's feet and climbing toward the sky. Shapes moved inside the mist, slow, strange, and silent. They were not human. They were creatures from another world, waking from a long sleep. Elias tried again to reach Martin, but the cold stopped him. His breath turned to frost, and his hands shook. He knew it was too late. The gate had opened, and the creatures were coming through. He looked at Lena, who was already moving toward the circle. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into the edge of the mist and reached for the map. Martin saw her, but he didn't move. His eyes were locked on the mist, as if he was waiting for something. Lena grabbed the map and held it tightly. The symbols on the parchment flared with light, brighter than before. The stones around the circle began to shake, and the mist pulled back slightly. The gate was reacting to her touch. She focused on the symbols, remembering everything she had learned. She whispered the old words she had studied in the library, and the map responded. The light grew stronger, and the mist began to fade. The creatures paused, confused by the change. The gate started to close. Martin stepped deeper into the mist. He didn't look back. His body became part of the fog, and then he was gone. The map in Lena's hands burned with heat, and the symbols turned to ash. She dropped it, and the wind carried the ashes away. The stone circle went dark. The ground stopped shaking. The cold faded. Elias and Lena stood in silence, watching the last of the mist disappear into the sky. The gate was closed, but the memory of what had happened remained. They had stopped something dangerous, but they had also lost something. Martin had crossed into a world that was not meant for humans. The map was gone, and the balance between realms had shifted. Elias knew the work was not over. There were other maps, other gates, and other secrets waiting to be found. Lena looked at the stones one last time. She had faced fear and acted with courage. She had protected the world from something unknown. And now, she understood the true power of the maps, and the responsibility that came with them. Together, they turned and began the long walk back down the mountain. The wind returned, soft and quiet. The sky cleared, and the stars began to shine. The gate was closed, but the story was not finished. Chapter 6. Return. Elias and Lena walked down the mountain in silence. The wind was soft again, and the sky above Bergen was clear. The danger had passed, but the memory of what happened stayed with them. They had seen the gate open. They had felt the cold of another world. And they had watched Martin disappear into the mist. Now, they were returning to the place where it all began, the library. The building looked the same from the outside. Its stone walls stood strong, and the windows reflected the morning light. But inside, something had changed. Elias felt it the moment he stepped through the door. The air was different. It was still quiet, but not peaceful. It was alert, like the library itself was watching. They walked through the halls slowly. Elias checked the vault first. The broken glass had been cleaned, but the space where the map had rested was still empty. He placed a new cloth over the case and marked it with a protective symbol. It was one of many he had started to draw. He used chalk, ink, and carved wood. Each symbol was meant to guard the library, to keep the boundary between worlds strong. Lena helped him every day. She studied the books, looking for old languages and forgotten signs. She wrote notes, tested patterns, and listened to the whispers that came from the maps at night. Some maps had started to change. Their lines moved slowly, like rivers shifting course. Others spoke in soft sounds, not words, but feelings. Elias and Lena learned to read them together. They worked in the quiet hours, often by candlelight. Elias taught Lena how to sense the energy of each map. He showed her how to seal a scroll with care and how to listen without fear. Lena brought new ideas. She suggested ways to strengthen the symbols and protect the vault. She was brave and focused, and Elias trusted her more than anyone. Outside the library, life in Bergen continued. People walked the streets, sold goods at the market, and talked about the coming winter. They didn't know what had happened in the mountains. They didn't know that a gate had opened and closed. Elias and Lena didn't speak of it. They kept the story between them, written only in their journals and marked in quiet symbols on the walls. But the change was real. Some books began to shift their text. Words moved from one page to another. Sentences rewrote themselves. Elias watched carefully. He didn't panic. He understood that the boundary between worlds had become thinner. The gate was closed, but the line was not as strong as before. He began to prepare. He made new locks for the vault. He placed symbols at every entrance. He trained Lena to recognize signs of danger. They didn't know if another gate would open, or if something had followed Martin through the mist. But they were ready. The library became more than a place of knowledge. It became a place of protection. Elias was no longer just an archivist. He was a guardian. Lena was no longer just a researcher. She was a keeper of signs. Together, they watched over the forgotten maps and the stories they held. They knew the danger was not gone. But they also knew that courage, wisdom, and care could hold the line. They had faced the unknown and returned stronger. And now, they were ready for whatever came next. Chapter 7. The Keeper. Winter came slowly to Bergen. Snow covered the rooftops, and the sea near the harbor turned quiet and still. Inside the old library, the air remained warm, filled with the scent of parchment and candle wax. Elias Thorvald continued his work, but now he was more than an archivist. He had become a guardian, not just of maps, but of the thin line between worlds. He spent his days walking through the library halls, checking the protective symbols carved into the wood and stone. He added new ones each week, using chalk, ink, and even silver dust when needed. These symbols were not just decoration. They held power, drawn from old knowledge and careful study. Elias had learned how to read the signs of change. He could feel when a map was restless or when a book whispered too loudly. He had grown more sensitive, more aware. His hands were slower now, but his mind was sharp. He kept a journal with notes about every shift in the library's energy. He wrote about the symbols, the dreams he had, and the strange patterns that sometimes appeared on the walls. He didn't fear these things. He respected them. He knew that fear could lead to mistakes, and mistakes could open doors that should stay closed. Lena Hartvig worked beside him. She had changed too. Her eyes were brighter, and her movements more focused. She had started writing a book about forgotten worlds, using her own research and the stories Elias had shared. She didn't want to publish it widely. She said it was meant for those who were ready to understand, not for those who were curious without care. She spent hours studying the old languages, comparing symbols from different maps and scrolls. She discovered patterns that even Elias had missed. She was brave, but she was also thoughtful. She asked questions, but she never rushed. She had learned that some answers take time, and some truths are better left in silence. The library began to change as well. People from the city started visiting more often. They came not to take, but to learn. Some were students, others were travelers, and a few were seekers of deeper knowledge. Elias welcomed them with quiet kindness. He taught them how to listen to the maps, how to respect the silence, and how to understand that not everything should be explored. He didn't tell them about the gate or about Martin West. That story was part of the library now, hidden in symbols and sealed pages. But he taught them the lesson it had given him. That true strength is not in knowing everything, but in knowing what must be protected. He reminded them that some doors are not meant to be opened, no matter how beautiful they seem. Lena helped guide the visitors. She showed them the safe maps, the ones that taught history and wonder without danger. She kept the deeper knowledge locked away, marked with signs only she and Elias understood. Together, they created a balance, a place where curiosity could grow without risk. Elias often sat by the window in the evenings, watching the snowfall. He thought about the past, about the quiet years before the gate opened, and about the months after. He didn't regret anything. He had done what was needed. He had protected the world, even if most people would never know. He looked at the library and felt peace. It was no longer just a building. It was a living place, full of memory and meaning. It held stories that could change lives, and secrets that could destroy them. And it had a keeper, someone who understood that guarding knowledge was not about control, but about care. Elias knew that danger might return one day. Another map might wake, another gate might call. But he also knew that he was ready. He had Lena beside him, and he had the strength that comes from quiet responsibility. He was the keeper. And he would keep the balance, no matter what came next. Moral: true strength is not in knowledge, but in responsibility. To protect something means knowing that not everything should be opened. Some doors are better left closed. And some maps are meant to be guarded, not followed. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.